In the frozen skies over Germany in December 1943, a moment of mercy would spark a story that would span continents, decades, and the very boundaries of war itself. The American pilot, a young man named Charlie Brown, was at the controls of Battery B-17 Flying Fortress, his crew wounded, his aircraft riddled with holes, and his mission all but doomed. They had just completed a bombing run over Bremen, but the cost had been nearly fatal. Flak had torn through the fuselage, engines sputtered, and the tail was shredded. As the bomber limped through enemy airspace, losing altitude and trailing smoke, the crew braced for the inevitable, a final attack from the Luftwaffe that would send them plunging to their deaths. But what happened next would defy every expectation, every rule of war, and every instinct for survival. Out of the clouds appeared a German Messerschmitt Bf 109, piloted by Franz Stigler, an ace with more than 20 victories to his name and a reputation for both skill and ruthlessness. The crippled B-17 was an easy target, and the rules of engagement were clear, so Stigler had every reason to finish the job. Yet, as he pulled alongside the stricken bomber, he saw something that gave him pause. He could see the terrified faces of the American crew, the bloodied tail gunner hunched over his guns, and the desperate efforts to keep the plane in the air through the broken plexiglass. In that instant, Stigler was transported back to a lesson from his own past, a warning from his commanding officer that, if I ever hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself. The code of honor among pilots, the unwritten rules of chivalry, suddenly outweighed the brutal calculus of war. Instead of pulling the trigger, Stigler made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He gestured to Brown, signaling for him to turn toward neutral Sweden, then flew in formation with the B-17, shielding it from German anti-aircraft batteries and escorting it safely out of enemy territory. Stigler didn't peel away until the bomber was clear, when he gave the bomber one last salute before disappearing into clouds. For Charlie Brown and his crew, the encounter was nothing short of a miracle. They managed to nurse their crippled aircraft back to England, landing with barely enough fuel and strength to spare. The debriefing officers listened in disbelief as Brown recounted the story of the German pilot who had spared their lives. The official report was filed, but the details were so extraordinary that many dismissed them as a product of shock or wishful thinking. For Brown, however, the memory was seared into his soul, a moment of humanity in the midst of unimaginable violence, a fleeting connection between enemies that transcended the war raging around them. As the years passed and the world moved on from the horrors of World War II, Brown found himself haunted by the memory of that day. He wondered what had become the German pilot, whether he had survived the war, whether he remembered the encounter, whether he had ever known the impact of his act of mercy. For decades, Brown searched for answers, writing letters, combing through records, reaching out to veterans organizations on both sides of the Atlantic. The search became a quest, a way to make sense of the chaos and cruelty of war, a hope that somewhere, somehow, he could thank the man who had given him and his crew a second chance at life. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Franz Stigler carried his own memories of that day. The war had left its scars. Friends lost, missions flown, a homeland in ruins. He had survived the conflict, emigrated to Canada, and built a new life far from the battlefields of Europe. Yet the image of the battered B-17, the faces of its crew, and the decision he had made in the skies above Germany never left him. He wondered if the American crew had survived, if they had made it home, if they remembered the German pilot who had chosen mercy over destruction. For 40 years, the two men lived parallel lives, separated by distance, language, and the passage of time, yet forever linked by a single act of compassion. It was not until the late 1980s, as the world began to rediscover the stories of World War II's veterans, that their paths would finally cross again. Brown, now retired and living in Florida, placed an ad in a German pilot's newsletter describing the encounter and asking if anyone knew the identity of the Luftwaffe pilot who had spared his life. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters poured in from across Germany, from former pilots, historians, and ordinary citizens moved by the story. Among them was a letter from Franz Stigler, who recognized the details of the encounter and knew, without a doubt, that he was the man Brown had been searching for. The two men began a correspondence, exchanging letters, photographs, and memories of that fateful day. The connection was instant and profound, a bond forged in the crucible of war, tempered by decades of longing and gratitude. In 1990, nearly half a century after their first meeting in the skies, Brown and Stigler finally met face to face in a tearful reunion that made headlines around the world. They embraced as brothers, not as former enemies, their friendship a testament to the enduring power of forgiveness, empathy, and the shared humanity that can survive even the darkest chapters of history. Their story, once a secret known only to a handful of men, became a symbol of reconciliation and hope, a reminder that even in the midst of war, acts of kindness and courage can echo across generations. The reunion between Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler was more than just a meeting of two men. It was a culmination of a journey that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances and had grown into a story that would inspire people around the world. When they finally stood face to face, both men were overcome with emotion, their eyes reflecting the weight of 40 years of searching, wondering, and hoping. They spoke at first in halting English and German, but soon the language barrier melted away, replaced by the universal language of shared experience and mutual respect. Brown thanked Stigler for his mercy, for the lives he had saved, for the example he had set in a world gone mad with violence. In response, Stigler expressed his relief at the crew's survival and appreciation for the opportunity to finally meet the men he had saved. Using information from both sides of the cockpit glass, the two men spent hours reminiscing about that day. Brown described the terror and confusion as the B-17 limped through enemy territory, the desperate attempt to keep the plane aloft, the moment when he saw the German fighter pull alongside and expected the end to come at any second. Stigler shared his own perspective. The shock at seeing the battered bomber, the realization that the crew was helpless, the internal struggle between duty and conscience, and the decision to risk his own life and reputation by refusing to finish off a defenseless enemy. As they talked, it became clear that their encounter had changed both men in profound ways. For Brown, it was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there could be light, that the enemy was not always a faceless monster, but a fellow human being capable of compassion and honor. It was a confirmation that Stigler's act of mercy had not been in vain, as well as a validation of the values he had attempted to uphold. Their friendship blossomed quickly, built on a foundation of mutual admiration and a shared understanding of the horrors and complexities of war. They visited each other's homes, met each other's families, and became as close as brothers. They attended reunions together, spoke at schools and veterans events, and shared their story with anyone who would listen. Their bond was so strong that they began to refer to each other as brother, a title that carried more weight than any medal or military honor. People from all walks of life were captivated by the story of their friendship as it spread across the globe. Newspapers and television stations ran features on the enemies who became brothers, and their tale was included in books and documentaries about the war. For many, their story was a welcome antidote to usual narratives of hatred and revenge, a reminder that reconciliation and forgiveness were possible even after the most bitter of conflicts. Brown and Stigler became symbols of a different kind of heroism, not the kind measured in kills or victories, but in the courage to choose mercy over violence, to see the humanity in one's enemy, to reach across the divide and build a bridge where others saw only a chasm. Their friendship also had a profound impact on their families. The Browns and the Stiglers became close, sharing holidays, milestones, and memories. The children and grandchildren of both men grew up hearing the story of the day when an act of mercy changed the course of two lives, and perhaps, in some small way, the course of history. The families forged their own bonds, united by the legacy of compassion and understanding that their fathers had created. As the years passed, Brown and Stigler continued to share their story, traveling together to speak at events and to meet with veterans and students. They were often asked what had motivated them to act as they did, and their answers were always humble and heartfelt. Brown spoke of the fear and desperation he had felt, the gratitude he owed to the man who had spared his life. Stigler spoke of the code of honor he had learned from his mentors, the belief that there were limits to what was acceptable in war, the conviction that mercy was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. Their message resonated with audiences young and old, reminding them that the choices we make, even in the most difficult circumstances, can have lasting consequences. The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler became a touchstone for discussions about ethics, morality, and the true meaning of heroism. It was cited as an illustration of the power of empathy and the significance of seeing the world through the eyes of others in classrooms, military academies, and places of worship. Their friendship was a living testament to the idea that reconciliation is possible, that the wounds of war can be healed, and that the bonds of brotherhood can transcend even the deepest divisions. As they grew older, Brown and Stigler remained as close as ever, their friendship a source of comfort and joy in their later years. They continued to honor the memory of those who had not survived, to speak out against the horrors of war, and to advocate for peace and understanding among all people. Their story, once a private memory shared by two men, had become a beacon of hope for the world, a reminder that even in the darkest times, acts of kindness and courage can light the way forward. As the years rolled on, the friendship between Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler deepened, becoming a living testament to the power of forgiveness and the enduring bonds that can form even between former enemies. The two men found themselves in demand at veterans' reunions, schools, and historical societies, where they would recount the events of that fateful day and the decades-long search that had brought them together. Their story, once a private miracle, became a public inspiration. Each time they told their story, they emphasized not just the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting, but the ordinary humanity that lay at its heart. They spoke of the fear and uncertainty that every pilot felt, the split-second decisions that could mean life or death, and the way that war, for all its brutality, could sometimes reveal the best in people. Brown would describe the terror of watching the German fighter approach, the disbelief as it pulled alongside instead of opening fire, and the overwhelming relief when he realized that Stigler was not there to kill, but to guide him home. Stigler, for his part, would recall the moment he saw the battered B-17, the faces of the wounded crew, and the memory of his own brother, lost earlier in the war, which had shaped his decision to show mercy. Their talks were never about boasting or self-congratulation. Instead, they were about the lessons they had learned and the hope that others might find inspiration in their example. They encouraged young people to look beyond stereotypes and propaganda, to see the individual behind the uniform, and to remember that every act of kindness, no matter how small, could have ripple effects that lasted a lifetime. Their message resonated deeply, especially with those who had experienced conflict or loss, and they received countless letters from people around the world who had been moved by their story. Some wrote to say that the tale had helped them forgive old grievances. Others said it had inspired them to reach out to former adversaries or to seek reconciliation in their own lives. Brown and Stigler cherished these letters, seeing in them proof that their story had meaning far beyond their own lives. As they entered their twilight years, the two men remained inseparable, visiting each other as often as possible and speaking on the phone when distance or health kept them apart. They celebrated birthdays and holidays together, shared family milestones, and supported each other through illness and loss. Their bond was so strong that they often joked they were closer than brothers, united not by blood, but by a shared experience that few could truly understand. When one of them faced a health crisis, the other was there to offer comfort and support, and their families became as close as any extended kin. The story of their friendship continued to spread, finding new audiences with each retelling. It was featured in documentaries, books, and news articles, and was even the subject of academic studies on psychology of forgiveness and the ethics of war. Historians marveled at the improbability of their meeting, while ethicists pointed to their choices as examples of moral courage in the face of overwhelming pressure to conform. For Brown and Stigler, however, the story was never about fame or recognition. It was about honoring the memory of those who had not survived, and about showing the world that even in the darkest times, there was always room for hope. They often spoke of the men they had lost, the friends and comrades who had not come home, and they dedicated their talks and appearances to those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Their friendship became a way to keep those memories alive, to ensure that the lessons of the past would not be forgotten. As the end of their lives approached, both men expressed gratitude for the chance to have known each other, to have found peace and understanding after so many years of searching. They hoped that their story would continue to inspire future generations, to remind people that the true measure of a person was not in the battles they fought, but in the compassion they showed to others. When Franz Stigler passed away in 2008, followed by Charlie Brown just a few months later, their families and friends gathered to celebrate not just their lives, but the extraordinary bond they had shared. Letters, photographs, and mementos from their decades-long friendship were displayed, and stories were told of the day when an act of mercy in the skies over Germany had changed the course of 2 lives forever. The legacy of their friendship endures, a beacon of hope and reconciliation in a world that too often forgets the power of forgiveness. Their story is a reminder that even in the midst of war, humanity can triumph over hatred, and that the bonds we form in the most unlikely of circumstances can last a lifetime and beyond. In the final chapter of their remarkable journey, the story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler became more than just a tale of wartime mercy. It became a living lesson in the enduring power of empathy, the healing of old wounds, and the hope that even the most bitter enemies can become the closest of friends. As the world changed around them, with new generations growing up far removed from the horrors of World War II, Brown and Stigler's friendship stood as a bridge between past and present, a testament to the idea that reconciliation is not only possible, but necessary for true peace. Their families, now forever intertwined, continue to honor the legacy of their fathers, sharing the story at schools, museums, and community gatherings, ensuring that the lessons of compassion and forgiveness would not be lost to time. The battered B-17, immortalized in photographs and memories, became a symbol not just of survival, but of the moment when one man's refusal to pull the trigger changed the course of 2 lives, and perhaps, in some small way, the course of history itself. Veterans who heard their story found comfort in the knowledge that the bonds of brotherhood could transcend even the deepest divides, while young people saw in their example a call to look beyond prejudice and enmity, to seek understanding in common ground. The story was retold in books, documentaries, and even in classrooms, where teachers used it to spark discussions about ethics, war, and the choices that define us. Brown and Stigler's legacy was not just in the headlines or the history books, but in the quiet moments when someone chose kindness over anger, forgiveness over revenge, or understanding over judgment. Their friendship, forged in the crucible of war and tempered by 40 years of searching, became a beacon for all who believe that the human spirit can rise above even the darkest circumstances. In their final years, both men reflected often on the journey that had brought them together. They spoke of the pain and loss of war, but also the joy and healing that came from finding a friend where once there had been only an enemy. They encouraged others to reach out, to listen, to forgive, and to remember that every act of mercy, no matter how small, can echo across generations. When they pass away, their families and friends gathered not just to mourn, but to celebrate a friendship that had changed their lives and touched the hearts of countless others. The story of the American pilot who searched for 40 years for the enemy who saved him and the German fighter who became his brother remains a powerful reminder that the lines drawn by war are not as permanent as they seem, and that the choices we make, even in the heat of battle, can shape the world for the better. Today, their story lives on in the memories of those who knew them, in the lessons taught to new generations, and in the hope that, no matter how divided we may seem, there is always a path to understanding, forgiveness, and brotherhood. The legacy of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler is not just a story from the past. It is a call to action for present and the future, a challenge to each of us to look for the humanity in others, to reach across the divides that separate us, and to believe that, even after 40 years or a lifetime, it is never too late to become brothers.